I want to give you a bit more clarity from today's lesson about tradition and modernity. I'm going to speak reasonably quickly and see how we go. But feel free to ask me questions in class if you've got any more. I like to start off with this quote: "Tradition is the illusion of permanence." Woody Allen's always got a great way of putting things, and I think that puts this in an interesting perspective. An image like this one can be particularly useful as a starting point to see tradition and modernity encapsulated in one image. This image here also does that. National Geographic had a concern for this with the tensions, I guess, in women's identity across the world between the impact of modernity on, I guess, traditional cultures and the impact that had on women's identity. This particular image here brings tradition and modernity into the same physical space here, where we can see that working side by side. That tradition and modernity aren't necessarily in tension with each other. Modernity does not swallow up tradition necessarily. But let's begin here, or at least move over here, into some kind of a sense to what modernity is. And we need to trace it back to the Enlightenment period in the 16th century, 17th century. The Enlightenment period saw a decline in church authority and the emergence of science. We're talking about this period of Isaac Newton and moving through all of the scientists in the 17th century who radically changed how we view the world. And we could even go earlier than Newton to Galileo and Copernicus and people like that. They started looking at rules in the universe and how the universe behaved predictably, and then the natural world behaved predictably. And this would then move on to people like Charles Darwin, and then into Einstein in the 20th century, looking at scientific explanations of the universe. It also, with the emergence of science, then moved into the human fields with the emergence of psychiatry and psychology in the 20th century, bringing a scientific explanation to human behaviour. But going back to the 17th century, we need to then also look at modernity's impact on culture, or on society, that is. We see the emergence of the rule of law governing everything, and nobody being above the law, and the rule of law being an essential part for societies to function. We see from the 17th century and the 18th century, the American and French revolutions that established democracy in the Western Hemisphere, but also in England, despite maintaining a monarchy, the parliamentary democracy there gained more authority that modernity required. It could not function under the old rules of kings and aristocrats. Industrialisation through the Industrial Revolution changed everything. It moved people from being able to really just use their own labour to make money or to make a living, to becoming parts of the almost a unit of production in themselves, part of a factory line. And this really took off in the 18th century, 19th century. And during this period, we see the emergence of the welfare state and taxation being used in ways that hadn't been used 300-400 years earlier. By that I mean in the 1400s, taxes were raised to pay for the extravagances of the monarchy and for the local, and paying homage, I guess, to the local duke or earl or lord, and moving in from the 19th to 20th centuries into taxation being to provide services, to build hospitals, to build roads, to build public works for the public good, to build the whole economy. And in this period we have mass education. So education moving from something that that individuals paid for, usually through church-run schools, to government-run, government-funded, taxpayer-funded education, because mass education was important for the whole economy. And then we move in the 20th century to open trade and globalization. So modernity works on a couple of levels, but it works on standardizing and categorizing almost every aspect of culture. And modernity gets kind of dovetailed into this notion of progress. So when we think about modern, don't think about the word new. Think about this process that began with the Enlightenment period of organising our world and rationalising our world. And this is in stark contrast, in many ways, to this idea of tradition. Tradition is governed by these notions of belief, of custom, of ritual, the things that we've always done, and oftentimes when the explanations become foreign to us, we can see many things in our own culture where people don't know the origins of them, but we just still keep doing them. And a common example would be Boxing Day. Very few people would know what this tradition of Boxing Day indeed even is. And some traditions are new and have this concept, this perception of being old. Again, going to Boxing Day, in cricket circles, we have this idea of the Boxing Day cricket test as being a traditional thing, when in fact it's actually quite new. But it's swallowed up into this ritual, this custom of what should happen around that time of the year. And it gives us this connection to the past and a sense of community. Tradition is not a bad thing. It's not the enemy of modernity, although the two often exist in tension with each other. And so here's one of the key questions that arise. What are the implications of modernity for language and identity? What does modernity do for our public and private discourse, for how we talk? How does it influence our language? How does it influence our identity, our concept of who we are? And this is a central question in Brian Friel's translations. Indeed, this is a key question in a lot of literature that deals with this tension between modernity and tradition. Another key question is, how does modernity relocate power? Power is neither created nor destroyed. It is simply relocated if we accept Foucault's idea that power isn't held by people. Power is a word we use to describe these complex relationships involving truth, knowledge, and authority. And so what we've seen in the 20th century in particular is a bunch of theoretical challenges to modernity. Marxism would critique modernity, suggesting that it simply relocates power from the nobility 400 years ago to the capitalists, to the industrialists, the factory owners. And the Marxist critique would say we need to change that and give the power to the proletariat, to the workers. Feminists would critique the forces of modernity, saying it serves simply to further disempower women, to disempower women through this process of rationalisation and to enshrine inequality. And indeed, we can look at all different kinds of gender critiques, including how masculinity is represented. But interestingly, I find that we could even argue there's a certain liberation created by modernity. An example would be Facebook, providing for, I think, 51 different gender identities. There's modernity, I guess, at its finest, coming up with categories and then coming up with this infinite number of categories. Another key one is postcolonialism, and I've left this one to last because it's one of the dominant critiques of modernity, because it forces us to look at the impact of all these processes of modernity on places like Africa, on Ireland, considering if we think of Ireland as a colonised nation that had modernity thrust upon it by the English, the impact of modernity on Australia and South America, and on First Nations tribes in Canada and Native Americans. So this question of modernity and tradition, it's a mistake to think of them as one being good or bad, or that discourse of good and bad is not helpful. What's useful is to look at the tension that we see between the two and how literary works often explore that tension. So I hope this has been useful to you. Feel free to ask me any questions in class.